Hi everyone. So I'm going to present our keynote speaker today,
Okay.
which is Mike Milinkovic from the Eclipse Foundation. Mike has a very long story in the industry. He was involved in it for like 30 years, doing a lot of things related to software engineering, but also to product management, intellectual property licensing, and other things. He has been the executive director of the Eclipse Foundation since 2004. And in that role, he has been supporting the Eclipse open source community and the commercial ecosystem around it. So he is quite knowledgeable on the software ecosystems, let's say from the point of view of the practitioner. Before joining Eclipse, Mike was a vice president of Oracle's development group. And he has been also with IBM and Nortel Research. Mike has also been on the board of the Open Source Initiative, OSI, and the OpenJDK community, and has been also in the executive committee of the Java community process. On a personal note, I met Mike, I don't know, maybe 8 years ago or something in FOSDEM. And it was quite interesting because, well, we were starting a startup related to metrics, and it was like talking to him, and are you interested in metrics over the Eclipse ecosystem? And he says, yes, let's talk. And that means how approachable he is. So I think that you should be taking the opportunity of talking to him today. So prepare your questions. The questions can be, of course, related to the talk, but he is very knowledgeable on all of these things that we are researching. So feel free to have the impression of a real practitioner of anything that you may be interested in. Mike, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Jesus. I really appreciate it. And I really want to thank everybody for the opportunity to come and speak to you today. I had an enormous amount of fun putting together this presentation because to a certain degree, it was a sort of a trip down memory lane. And it's really been about trying to create sort of a narrative on how open source health has impacted the foundation, our projects, communities, myself, and the staff of the Eclipse Foundation. And I just want to start off by saying that there's a bit of a narrative that I'm going to walk everybody through, and keep in mind that I am not an academic, and I don't have a huge amount of data to back up my claims. I've gone through old presentations and old discussions and try to sort of reconstruct some history here. I think I've come up with a pretty interesting story, but don't be too harsh if necessarily all the facts don't line up. But one thing to keep in mind is sort of to set the stage for what's going on here. And when I say, or when Jesus introduced me, I've been the executive director of the Eclipse Foundation. It's literally 17 years last week, and the world has changed enormously in those last 17 years. And one of the most important things is to understand is that software has eaten the world. And there's lots of different variations of what that means, including the original definition by Mark Andreessen. But to me, really the key point to remember is that for almost every sector of the economy or the society, software is now driving innovation and new capabilities, and really software has become the way that we innovate almost in every aspect of life and business. But open source has now gobbled up software. So open source has become the way to build software. And one of the major transitions I've seen over the last 17 years is the transition from open source was a way to commoditize, cheapen, maybe even do a more effective version of, but it was a way to take another operating system to compete with Windows, for example. But it was really about kind of commoditizing things that had already been invented. Nowadays, whether you're talking, started with big data, but now if you're talking AI or edge compute or, any of the major initiatives, major new technology trends on the next big thing, open source is actually leading how those technologies are being adopted. So it's really a completely different world now than it was 17 years ago. With the importance of software and then inherently the importance of open source. But, and I think this is sort of the subtext of my entire presentation, be careful what you wish for, because with great power comes great responsibility. And I think all of us that are involved in the open source community, certainly I, over the past 17 years, it's been a real journey in terms of, a certain set of things in terms of what you thought a healthy project or a healthy community was. That's a constantly evolving, and it's always getting larger. And I think the reason why it's getting larger is because of the importance of open source, and with that power comes responsibility. So let's start the trip down memory lane. So 2002, the Eclipse Foundation, the original Eclipse project was started in November of 2001. That's when it went live, and it really kind of hit its stride going into 2002. In the first couple of releases, the definition of health was, getting the darn thing to work, and work better. And one of the things that the team really worked on was, and this is one of the, I think, arguably one of the first projects, open source projects, that did this systematically, was they really embraced testing in the large. And it was actually from this project team that I learned the idea that, constant testing and testing in the large, CI, CD with test runs every single build, right? This actually helps you. This isn't about finding bugs. This is about giving you more freedom to innovate, because the confidence that if you do something that's bogus, it's going to get noticed. So starting in the very, very early days, we did enormous amounts of testing, both unit testing and performance testing. And, every single night the developers would get a report that say, hey, the changes that you made yesterday actually slowed things down. And so, the health of what we were measuring was the function and the performance of the software itself. And that was kind of how we started off thinking about, what's healthy software. And then, of course, when you start shipping an open source project, one of the things you want to find out is, does anyone care? Is anyone using our stuff? So then the next definition of health was, what was the usage base? And just a really funny historical note, that the picture there, it's on the screen, that actually really is the very first Eclipse download server. I think it was a 486 machine with something like a 500 megabyte drive connected directly to the Ethernet, to the internet. It was a horrific failure, because the team had no idea how popular this would be, and so that poor little server lasted for just a couple of weeks before it became obvious that it had to be replaced. But measuring how people are or whether people are using your technology was of great interest. And so we actually started, we upped our game in terms of the infrastructure, and started measuring downloads or download requests as a proxy for usage. And then we actually were able to find market surveys. This one is one that's kind of cool. So in the market in Japan, oh gosh, what year was this? But the idea, it's 2002. Sorry, 2002. The Eclipse market share was almost unmeasurable. You can see that. And then by 2004, 61% of Java developers in Japan were using Eclipse. So these kinds of market share surveys became of great interest to us. And Forrester did this one that said back in 2006 that 70% of Java developers were either using Eclipse or Eclipse-based IDEs, and the two IBM ones there that are listed were also based on Eclipse. So then, just again, following with the definition of health, it's like, so we were confident that we were healthy at that time just because of the sheer number of users. The next thing we looked at was, okay, so we got working code, we got lots of users. What do we, what's the next thing that we should be caring about? And the next one that we really focused on was adopters. And when I say adopters here, what I'm talking about is other organizations, companies, picking up our technology and using it in their products. So one of the things that we did was implement the world's most annoying and complicated IP policy. So for those who have followed Eclipse for many years, we have this has been dramatically reduced since, but for many years we had a well-deserved reputation as having a lot of IP management that got in the way of development. But the reason why we did that was not just because we're a bunch of masochists, but the reason why we did this is that meant that the code that came out of the Eclipse Foundation was extremely safe for commercial adoption. So we did this work specifically to help with adopters. Another thing that we did very early days, starting in 2006, I think it was, with Callisto, was starting to do what we called simultaneous release, or the release train. And so one of the things that the Eclipse community has always been very proud of is this. We've now got 16 years of history, I think, where we have shipped major releases on time, to the day, every year. And so these releases would come out every June for many, many years. We've actually now shortened that release cadence to quarterly. But again, the predictability that we provided these releases with was something that really helped foster adoption. And we specifically did this to make it easier for folks to build products on top of it. We actually had a well-documented development process that the platform project team used to help drive this. I'm not going to go into this in any great detail, or at all really, but they basically devised an agile development process specifically to help deliver these annual releases with regular milestones in between, and getting a lot of the community to try out the milestones because they were decent enough quality. And so it really drove this interest in adopters kind of circled back into the project team itself and the processes that they used. And by most measures, even to this day, I mean, this slide is current. A lot of people think of the Eclipse IDE as something that's Java related, but it's actually, in terms of adopters, it's arguably more prominent in the C and C++ development world, and particularly in embedded and real time and industrial sectors than our Java development tools. And so, this emphasis on providing code that can be adopted was something that we were eventually, quite successful with. So moving along, then, okay. So now, what's the next? What do we next think about healthy and supporting an ecosystem? Well, what do we mean by an ecosystem? And I have done many talks on this topic as well. But an ecosystem is an intentional business ecosystem that you build on top of a platform. And the platform, of course, that I'm talking about here is the original Eclipse IDE platform. And one of the things that was done really, really well is that provided what Tim O'Reilly called an architecture of participation. The ability for others to, without having any permission, be able to come along and extend the platform. And that, of course, was the original Eclipse plugin model. And all great open source ecosystems are built on top of some variation of this model. The device driver way to extend the Linux kernel, extensions for Firefox, and so on. These all help to drive the ecosystems that built up around these projects. In the particular case of Eclipse, one of the things that we did to help foster an ecosystem was the Eclipse Marketplace. So originally, and this, by the way, this screenshot is a very, very early screenshot. We had 1,100 solutions and counting, and really helped drive adoption of the Eclipse IDE and the use of it. We're at this point, we're at over 45 million downloads from the Eclipse Marketplace over all the years. with something like 1,400 different plugins in there. So definitely helped shape the ecosystem around the Eclipse IDE. So okay, so now we've talked about ecosystems. We're comfortable that we're getting adopters and users. Next thing we looked at from what is our definition of health is focusing on contributors. And so from the perspective of the lifeblood of every open source project is, do you have a constant influx of contributors? And kind of around the same time was this also, the simple fact of the matter was up until this point, IBM had been leading the development on the Eclipse IDE platform, and they were actually wanting to get other contributors. And so there was this, a lot of discussion internally about, how can we raise the rate of contribution? Not that we are short of contributions, and this is I can't remember what year this is from. Sorry, this is 2010, so this is probably, the date is probably 2009. And so what you're seeing here is first of all, notice we're one of the very only open source projects that is systematically tracked where our contributions are coming from member companies. And so there's that's something that's always been of great interest to us. Some communities try to downplay the corporate involvement. We try to actually, we think the better answer is to be completely transparent about where your contributions are coming from. Still have individual committers is still a very significant percentage of the community. But we started tracking contributions as one of the first steps towards you being able to increase them. And we still do this today. So this is some screenshots that I took yesterday, and just to give you an example of the kinds of metrics that we can look at on what we call the project management interface. So every project, we have over 400 projects at the Eclipse Foundation now. And by the way, I know this talk is kind of focusing on the IDE because that's what we have the most history on. But the every single one of the 400 projects we have at Eclipse, you can find this kind of data on. So what we're seeing here is Eclipse Orion, not a particularly healthy project at the moment. It's had fewer than 50 commits in total over the last year. 100% of the activity is from IBM, and there's only two people who have actually provided anything to the project over the last year. Or sorry, that last 3 months. Now let's see the kind of numbers that we see on what we consider a pretty healthy project. So Eclipse IDE platform. Remember I said it started off as an IBM only thing. It's now actually one of the most active and diverse projects that we have, where we see IBM's contributions is down to about 32%. Other committer, basically that's tracking contributions from that are not committers on this project, but perhaps elsewhere within the Eclipse community. And contributor is really, those are the people who, are, for lack of a better phrase, drive by sometimes. Just like, here is a contribution. It fixes a bug that I found of interest. And then you can see that the sheer number of people that are involved in this, there's 9 pages of individuals who are involved in this. So this is what you see when a project is healthy and vibrant. And we still track by companies as well. This is current data in terms of where we're getting our contributions. It's really interesting to see, DLR from Germany, and Robert Bosch is like number 2 and number 3. So it's pretty interesting. You can see that once upon a time IBM was probably 90% of all of the contributions to Eclipse on day when the foundation started day 1, and now it's down to about 7%. So moving forward, health, in terms of health, and the next thing that came to mind is security. Okay, now. You have to realize there was once upon a time a far more innocent world than we have today, and for the first number of years, we shipped the Eclipse, the Eclipse releases. They were not even signed. So every single time you started up Eclipse on, and this one's Windows, but you'd get equivalent messages on others. It would say, "Hey, this is an unsigned application. Are you sure you want to run this software?" And everybody would say yes, and none of the jars were signed, and so it was basically an absolute free-for-all. But like I said, it was a kinder and gentler time, so this was naturally not that unusual. So one of the things that we did in 2007 was start actually doing a common build infrastructure, where we were providing build infrastructure for all of our projects, and starting to get pretty adamant that every project needed to actually sign their executables and their jar files if they were shipping on Java, as part of just doing some very basic hygiene around security. Next thing up is 2010 or so. This, I think GitHub started in 2008, I think, first off. But basically, one of the transitions we went through in terms of, and saw this in terms of health was, but it was a big transition for us, is the death of the self-hosted Foundation Forge. Again, it's, this is ancient history at this point, but once upon a time, providing a well-functioning Forge for development was considered one of the key benefits that was given to the community by a foundation. And so we have we had a originally CVS-based source code control system, Bugzilla. We later on adopt Garrett and so on. But GitHub came along, and then it was very much a lot of pressure to modernize the forges that were provided to it, and we went through. This is actually from a proposal to the board of directors circa 2013 on how we want to do this. And long story short, we still to this day operate our own forge that's made up of Bugzilla, Garrett, and CGit. But we at this point, more than 50% of our projects are hosted on GitHub. Many of which, by the way, use our build infrastructure rather than GitHub Actions or the like, because they find it well supported and it's relatively easy to do. And everybody who does pretty much these days does use the signing service. But this is a big transition, and now what's healthy is measuring GitHub stars on our projects is something that is a sign of health. Another trend, and I put this down as 2013, is that's just more or less when we started paying attention to it. We were a little bit late to the game, but the emergence of social agency within open source communities, and I think that's again an important transition. But it wasn't really until 2013 before the Eclipse Foundation had a code of conduct and started to actually. And to be honest, we had the code of conduct, and it was several years before it was invoked. And I could probably talk a little bit about why that's true, because we're relatively the culture at the Eclipse Foundation has, because it comes from a certain corporate background. There was always this sort of element of professionalism, and using your work email addresses tended to keep people's behavior on the straight and narrow. But the code of conduct and starting to think more strongly about diversity activities and working with outreachy and these kinds of things became important to us. 2014, with Heartbleed, the whole topic of long-term sustainability in open source and using sustainability as one of the measures of a healthy community or a healthy project also became very current. We actually have a recent example of how we can help with a project sustainability with one called Eclipse BERT, the BI and reporting tools project that basically was moribund for a couple of years, and the foundation finally stepped in and basically fired all of the existing committers and project leaders who weren't doing anything, and invited interested parties from the community to step in and take over the projects. And so you can see that we went from basically a complete flat line to an actually a reasonably decent level of engagement, and BERT is now sort of back in good hands. So that's one of the ways that we can help with sustainability. And it's again, it's sort of charming to note that it wasn't until 2017 that the Eclipse Foundation became a CVE issuing authority, and actually set up a formal security policy and vulnerability reporting policy. Again, perhaps we were more than a little late to the game, but it just hadn't really honestly been a thing until it, of course, the inevitable happens and it becomes kind of a thing. There was a couple of things that turned around that became very, very important to us. One of the things involved in that, though, is that, again, sort of started from our roots and tools, but the Eclipse Foundation now has a ton of runtime projects at Eclipse Foundation, things like Jetty and Glassfish and so on, that are very commonly used in enterprise infrastructure, and most definitely need formality around their security vulnerability reporting requirements. Supply chain security, of course, is the topic of the day. And so SolarWinds hack in early this year really raised the profile of that. Then, just 2 weeks ago, the executive order on improving the US's cybersecurity attracted a lot of attention, just in general, but also within the open source community, because it specifically called for the delivery of software bill of materials for every product, and ensuring and attesting to the extent practicable to the integrity and provenance of open source software. So these are, as you can imagine, this is going to drive demand for even more work around security, traceability, software bill of materials, integrity, lack of vulnerabilities. There's going to be a whole bunch of effort that's going to be necessary to comply across the industry with this. Some of the things that we're doing in particular at the Eclipse Foundation, and this is like right now, is working on starting to dive into reproducible builds and vulnerability scanning. This vulnerability scanning we're going to make as an option for projects who want to build that into their Jenkins pipeline, so they can use Eclipse Steady to do vulnerability scanning every time they do a build. Reproducible builds, we're going to start with a couple of projects that have a specific interest in it. Things like Adoptium, which are doing JDK builds for Java runtimes. But reproducible builds is a great example of where it's going to be extremely difficult across our 400 projects, some of which are 20 years old, that have a very specific way of doing things. They've been very successful for a long time. Convincing them to change things over to do reproducible builds is a non-trivial community governance exercise. So that's going to be pretty interesting to watch. And then with perfect timing, the week I'm building my slides for this talk, we get a green foundation, and now the notion of carbon neutral coding is coming up, and as yet another definition of what does health mean in open source and for open source projects. So I think hopefully you've caught kind of the narrative that I'm talking about here. Is anyone using our stuff? So on and so on. The ever listing and growing definition of health, which leads me to sort of the summary. It works. Originally, we were all pretty happy when it worked. That was the definition of a healthy open source project. And now the definition of a healthy open source project, and I actually don't think this is too much of an exaggeration, is a working secure and carbon neutral code delivered on an environmentally friendly, sustainable, predictable, repeatable, and supply chain secure basis with millions of users and thousands of GitHub stars, along with a plethora of adopters in a large dynamic ecosystem, all delivered by a diverse and welcoming community, governed in an open and transparent manner with a commitment to equity and social justice. So I told you so. With great power comes great responsibility, and the amount of responsibilities that we've put on our open source projects has gone up dramatically. So conclusions. I hope I've convinced you that the sheer amount of the resources required to have what is considered a healthy open source project has increased dramatically. And many of these tasks fall outside the interests of most developers. So even talking about builds, certainly reproducible builds. There's a lot of developers for whom that's not their thing, and so that's I just note that with interest. Second point is the success of open source is forcing its industrialization and professionalization. So I think what we're seeing is more and more that hobbyist projects absolutely exist and occasionally can have a major impact. But before they can become truly widely adopted in an industry, they're going to have to go through some kind of professionalization or industrialization process. Which actually makes sort of the last point, that the ability of the hero programmer small teams to significantly impact the industry has been reduced, which is not necessarily a bad thing, because I think the myth of the hero programmer has been actually more than a little unhelpful, because successful open source has always been a team sport, and to the degree where we sort of attribute everything to one person, it's not terribly true or helpful. But I do have a concern that this ever-growing definitions of open source health is not necessarily sustainable, and even if it is, it's definitely changing the dynamics of how open source is created. So just a couple of parting thoughts. Is one of the things that occurs to me is that to have a truly healthy open source projects that have major impact and are truly successful, the two patterns that we're seeing more and more is they require the increasing support of the foundation. And increasing, what I mean there is, as the leader of an open source foundation, we see ever increasing demands on the services that we are expected to provide to take some of this burden off of the developers that are working on the project itself. The other model that's happening, and I personally, I'm only sort of okay with this, is the support of well-funded startups, where basically they do everything themselves because they have the money. I'm thinking, MongoDB or Elasticsearch and those kinds of folks there. And then finally, the third option is a mix, where you have a funded startup that works with a project that's hosted at a foundation. And we have a lot of good stories of doing entrepreneurial open source with Eclipse Foundation projects. And then the last parting thought is, it's important to note that GitHub has been trying to take some of this burden onto them as well, but with better build infrastructure, with GitHub Actions and like security scans, licensing options, code of conduct templates. So they are trying to also help the developers on open source projects with some of this. But I think that's it's necessary but not sufficient, because if you look at where do well-funded startups do their development, it's on GitHub. They take advantage of all of the stuff that GitHub is doing, but you still need the people, the resources to actually do all this stuff before you can claim victory. And with that, I thank you. I hope this talk has been of interest to folks, and I look forward to the questions.
So thank you very much, Mike. The talk has been very interesting, and the chat has been on fire. So I'm going to select some questions, starting, well, Tom has been doing some of them to begin with. So the first one, Tom Menz, is, what is your idea on the move from yearly to quarterly releases? What changed in the good and in the bad sense when moving from yearly to quarterly? What is, according to you, the most appropriate release duration related to this? And he's asking not only for Eclipse in particular, but for open source in general.
So the motivation for doing it, like why we did it, was because we were getting increasing feedback that the world is moving at a faster pace. And that just doing quarterly updates and basically shipping incremental both bug fixes and new features all the time was kind of the way the world was going. Now, so that's why we did it. What did we lose? Well, we added more stress to the team for sure. Because now the cycles are really, really short. They basically get 2 milestones and that's it. So the opportunities to do anything truly large and different is now a lot harder to do. But I actually think that everything that we see is now leading towards increased velocity of delivery, right? And that's to a certain degree being driven by the kind of continuous deployment scenarios that we see from the cloud. That's sort of becoming the expectation now. Yeah, so I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, thank you very much. Next question, also by Tom. How stable have contributions been over time? What's the turnover rate, if you know it? How long the contributions tend to remain active? So it's basically asking about the pattern of people contributing to
Yeah,
Eclipse.
so
And excuse me, Mike, he's also asking specifically whether you had specific problems retaining contributors or some kind of contributors or attracting them.
No, I don't. So I would say that I could probably spend 5 minutes and find the graphs to show you. So overall, the number of contributors is steadily and gradually increasing. So I think that's a good thing. The problem is what I'm talking about here is contributions across a portfolio of 400 different projects, right? So if you start to drill into each individual project, then the stories become more complicated, with some projects starting to taper off and other projects exploding. I personally think there's a lot of different explanations and there's a lot of different variables that are going on in there, but I think to a certain degree that is the inevitable life cycle of all software technologies. That there's when something is new, there's more excitement, you're going to attract more contribution. Once something gets into the much more mature stage, and it's stable and working, then you're going to see contributions start to tail off a bit.
Fabio Palomba is asking something quite related, which is, did you establish any mechanism to attract newcomers? And in general, how do you manage communication, collaboration among developers of different connected projects to the ecosystem?
So I missed the very first part.
So whether you established any specific mechanism to attract newcomers or just people came in? Oh,
yeah. So we actually have a new, first I'll preface this by saying our forums are archaic technology, something that we definitely need to improve, but we do have a newcomer forum which to this day is very, very active. I think, but that's primarily focused on IDE and modeling related topics. Where we're seeing a lot of increase in new contributions is areas like Jakarta EE and MicroProfile, which is they're generating their own excitement in their own communities, and so we're seeing a lot of growth there. And there, it's just areas like our community mailing lists and the Google groups and Slack channels. And so I don't know how everybody feels in this world, but I mean, on a daily basis, I deal with God knows how many mailing lists. I have about 14 different Slack workspaces that I have to look at every day. I have a group of people that thinks that Twitter DM is the way to get me. WhatsApp, I mean, it's a multi-channel world, and you kind of need to support as many of them as you can stand, to keep communications open.
Thank you, Mike. Another question from by Fabio. Did you notice a decrease or increase in terms of contributions when moving to GitHub? Do you think that GitHub had changed the way people interacted with the Eclipse Foundation?
We saw increase in interactions with projects, but when I said that over 50% of our projects are now hosted at GitHub, that's actually because once we started supporting GitHub, almost every single new project that came to us used GitHub, and so the relatively few projects migrated from our existing Forge to GitHub. But definitely there's no doubt in my mind that the pull request has become the unit of collaboration for most people in open source. And so we definitely think that it helped modernize the contributions to the Eclipse Foundation, and I think it's I'd have to go back to look at the numbers to see if there was any kind of step function when we first started using GitHub, but I don't think there was, because the number of projects was actually relatively low at the beginning. I mean, just so what's everybody understands, one of the things that we're working on is so our existing forge that we have that's uses cgit and Bugzilla and Garrett, over the next, say, year or two, we're going to be shutting that down and moving everybody over to a GitLab, a hosted GitLab instance, and that's the way that we're going to modernize our infrastructure.
Okay, thanks. Another question by Tamil Legay. Has the definition of health not evolved to be too all-encompassing? The 2021 version of the definition seems to include every possible aspect of software. Are software who fail one of the criterion listed all doomed to failure?
No, they're not doomed to failure, because in the end, if you have a really excellent solution to an important problem, people are going to want to use your stuff. What I can tell you from personal and direct experience is that as you become successful, the pressure to do all of the other things becomes extremely large. And to a certain degree, I think that should be expected, and there's nothing really wrong with it. If your project becomes extremely important and relevant, doing all of the security basics, seems to be a pretty obvious thing that you have to do. And honestly, if you are a successful project and community, having a code of conduct and being welcoming to a diverse group of people that want to make contributions, and making sure that you're not shutting people out of who can contribute to your community. I think that's another example of things that, wasn't really there in 2001, but I think that that your project is ultimately better for it.
Another question from Raula Gikabina. What is Eclipse's instance on keeping older and might be outdated projects? Or does Eclipse prefer to keep all projects updated and active?
It's sort of somewhere in the middle. So the Eclipse Foundation is one of the only foundations I know of where we regularly and deliberately garbage collect our projects. Right. So every year, well, pretty much every summer, we go through and we look for all of the projects that haven't been active for the past year. And we basically go to them and say, are you done? And if they're done, then we archive them and shut them off from active development. Not that many, as far as I know, not that many open source communities do that deliberately. Now, that said, there's been many times where we go to a project and say, hey, are you done? And they go, no, actually, for personal reasons or whatever, we couldn't do much this year, but this project is still of interest and we want to keep it going. And if, basically, if the project team says they want to keep it going, we don't force somebody to be shut down. We do. And we also, one sort of additional note on that is we also actively look at projects through the lens of the metrics, and if for example, like the a project that only has one company contributing to it, we go to them and say, what are you doing to help increase the diversity on your project, because this does not look like a healthy project.
So thanks. Another question by Dario Dinucci. Are newcomers a risk for security? Do they have any getting started concerned with security issues or something? He's wondering that an increasing number of contributors could compromise security. What do you think? No,
actually, I don't. So the contributors, there's a big difference between contributors and committers, right? So a contributor can't write any source code, right? anything that comes in from a contributor is reviewed by a committer before it's added to the code base. So so I don't see, I mean, so everything is code reviewed twice before it goes in. So I don't think there's, I mean, I suppose a genius and malicious hacker could get something inserted that shouldn't belong there, but generally speaking, we're pretty comfortable with our approach. And I think adding security vulnerability scanning will definitely help down the road. But one of the, and just kind of an aside, it's not necessarily security, but one of the areas that we think is particularly interesting is functional safety. And so we have 2 projects that are adding additional processes on top of the normal open source processes to get to the point where they can state that their outputs are safety qualified to, one of them is ISO 26262, and I think the other one is going with DO 178C. But it's just like, yeah, so actually having functional safety become part of processes is something that we're actively looking at. And of course, that's an aside. Functional safety and security are 2 orthogonal concerns.
Raula is clarifying with respect to the question on all the projects that the reference was to older and as stable and reliable compared to newer. So if you want to say something, but otherwise, there is another question by Tom too, which is related to the last one. And he says, it seems to become increasingly difficult to develop open source projects because of the ever increasing expectations. I mean, on top of functionality, you need security, code of conduct, actions, etc., etc. So what do you think?
Yeah, I think that was kind of the point of my talk. It is getting more difficult.
Sorry, let me finish the question. In this question, is development of a smaller scale open source projects actually sustainable with all of these requirements? And I think he's not referring to the kind of project that we are dealing with in the Eclipse Foundation, but you know, the typical small open source project of ages.
Sure. So I think if you have a small project that is a kind of a utility sort of thing, and there's some ecosystems where this is, you know, very much how things work. You know, a lot of the things that show up on NPM within the Node.js ecosystem, for example, can be quite small and managed by a quite small team. I think that's a great example of where, yeah, I mean, a lot of what I'm talking about here doesn't even necessarily apply, right? A lot of those, you know, Node packages are done by 1-person, 2-person teams. But what I'm focusing on is the kinds of projects that attract, you know, millions of users. And, you know, I think a presentation similar to what I just described for Kubernetes and the CNCF would probably be pretty interesting as well, right? It's just like as sort of an additional data point. I think there's when you get into large, widely used projects that are that are impacting the industry, whether it's through usage or adoption, then I think these things come into play.
Okay, I think this is the final question by Olga Baisal. Can you give examples of the metrics Eclipse uses for measuring carbon neutral coding practices?
Coding, what was the adjective before coding practices?
Carbon neutral. So sorry for my English. Carbon neutral.
So no, I don't. So that carbon neutral stuff literally happened, I think announced on Tuesday. And so I haven't even had a chance to read what they're talking about. But it's about having a more actually the hypothesis is that there are certain languages, certain programming languages, and certain patterns of programming that are more efficient than others. So trying to focus energy on doing sort of nudging developers towards the languages that are more efficient.
Okay.